This presentation, titled Internal Auditing and Risk, comes to us from Craig D'Souza. Craig is the Managing Director of eRisk 360 and a governance, risk management, and compliance professional with training across ISO management system, assurance, and certification. He is registered with Exemplar Global as a lead auditor in management systems, including quality, EMS, and OH&S. Craig's main area of focus is providing integrated risk management consulting, auditing, and training solutions across these areas, focusing on quality, environmental, and occupational health and safety risks. He has worked with startups as well as small, medium, and large global private and publicly listed high-growth ASX-traded companies. In addition, he has worked at both the state and national levels of the Australian government. And with that, take it away, Craig.
Thank you for the introduction, Mike. Welcome to this presentation, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. As Mike mentioned, my name is Craig D'Souza. I'm the Managing Director of eRisk 360, a boutique management consultancy focusing mainly on risk and compliance. We also provide consulting, training, and a podcast series. So just an overview of what I'll be covering in this session. The focus is on internal audits. It's a fairly generic presentation, but I will try and provide some examples throughout. This is the overview. I'll take you through what internal audits are, why they're important, what are the benefits of undertaking regular internal audits, how are internal audits conducted, and we'll go through some more practical areas of the internal audit process in terms of what I've learned auditing various companies, some of the key success factors to consider when performing internal audits, what are some common mistakes that organizations make, and what should organizations implement. Then I'll provide some references and further reading for you as well if you want to get into a little bit more in depth. But this material has been developed with some of the experiences that I've gained through undertaking various internal and external audits. So we'll start with some definitions, some basic definitions. The first one is from the Institute of Internal Auditors, Australia. And it says, internal audit is a dynamic profession involved in helping organizations achieve their objectives. It is concerned with evaluating and improving the effectiveness of risk management, control, and governance processes within an organization. The second definition is one that the audience may be more familiar with, as it's defined in ISO 19011, and it talks about a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining audit evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which the audit criteria is fulfilled. So you can see that the second definition is very much ISO aligned in terms of its the ability to collect that evidence, documented processes. So there are some key differences. The first definition is more about helping the organization achieve its objectives through various implementation of risk management processes and controls, whilst, as I mentioned, the second definition is more about those documented processes for obtaining evidence. So why are internal audits important? Internal audits provide an opportunity to regularly assess risks. You can identify whether the organization has implemented the right processes and controls and procedures. It also provides an opportunity for the organization to see if there are any inefficiencies or any potential improvements or innovations that can be made within the organization. Also, finally, it allows the organization to identify any strategic needs and priorities. So I guess in a way, it allows the organization to undertake a health check. Ideally, we want to prevent things from going wrong. So in the example of in the health context, usually people go to the doctors when they're sick, I guess. That's typically what people do. So think of internal audits as a person going to the doctor when they're feeling well, but they want to go in to get a checkup on their important vital signs. So things like their blood pressure, their pulse, temperature, just basic sort of check-ins. So think of internal audits as a preventative approach to managing the risks of an organization. And the management want to understand as much as they can during this process. So it's a really powerful way to uncover potential inefficiencies or bottlenecks. And it can highlight a number of things that can be done better. So what are the benefits of undertaking internal audits? I've listed some of the key benefits in this slide. So internal audits are typically performed regularly. However, one may not always have sufficient time to look at all the aspects of the system, but it's important to consider both the tangible and the intangible benefits. So what I really mean here is to make sure you cover all the high-risk elements of the organization, its operations. So you want to really make sure the internal audits provide management with that information, that intelligence, those insights on the key processes within the scope of the management system. So you want to have a preventative type of approach in managing risks. So you want to pick up issues before they potentially come about, before things go wrong. And what internal audits are intended to do is to provide that framework of picking up these issues before things go wrong. So again, as I mentioned previously, in the example of healthcare, if you have high blood pressure, for example, or high temperature, this may be an indication that something may be wrong. So picking up these things early is a vital indicator that something could potentially go wrong. Similar to undertaking an internal audit, it enables the organization to make changes and continually improve. Identify these early warning signs, track these potential issues so that the organizations can be more proactive as opposed to reactive. So how are internal audits conducted? So firstly, the audit should be conducted by objective, impartial, and properly trained people. The person undertaking the internal audit, the auditor, can be internal or external to the organization. The frequency of the audit is dependent on the size, the results of previous audits, the risks identified, which areas the risks have arisen from, things like incidents. So look at the data, look at the information, and start to target where you really want your internal audits to focus. And the internal audit reports should be presented directly to the CEO and the board. Obviously, the stakeholders need to be part of reviewing the internal audit report. The more information that is shared within the organization, the better it'll be to foresee any potential issues that may come about. So the internal audit process is a really important process. And at the same time, we're not trying to be prescriptive in how internal audits should occur, if it's annual or if it's biannual, or even more frequent for that matter. It's really based on a number of factors. It could be things like staff turnover, growth, whether or not the customer has acquired, whether or not the client has acquired new customers. So all these factors need to be considered when performing an internal audit. So some key success factors in undertaking internal audits. This is a list, some basic advice you should consider when conducting the audit and writing the report. So internal audit reports, they need to be independent viewpoints. You should clearly state the audit objective. What is the audit criteria and the scope? The audit findings should be based on evidence. Track your evidence. It always helps having a defensive writing approach in terms of the way you write your audit report and your audit findings. And finally, the recommendation should be clearly linked back to the audit findings. So what are some common mistakes that organizations make? So firstly, it's always best to articulate the audit objective, scope, and criteria. Be really clear what exactly you are auditing so you know what evidence you are looking for. So it goes without saying, it helps if you are familiar with the processes, also the industry. So make sure you do your research on the industry that you will be auditing. Staff shouldn't audit their own work. So get someone independent to perform the internal audit, someone from a different area. Only record findings that you have gathered evidence for. So stick within the audit scope and criteria. So whilst the desktop reviews, the reviewing of documentation is really important to performing the internal audit, observations play a critical role as well. So getting this feedback on the ground, observing people doing their jobs and their roles is a really big part of gathering that evidence that you need. So again, it's about evidence, evidence, evidence. It's good to learn about how to write your report defensively. As I mentioned before, a defensive writing skills really helps in being able to articulate your audit findings and being familiar with the audit objective and criteria. So following a logical approach, a format, and auditing against the criteria that you've developed. We don't want to go outside the scope of the audit. There's always limited time. We can't focus on everything depending on the size of the organization and the complexity. We really want to be as clear and as clear as we can before we audit. So make sure you do enough preparation to really define your scope of the audit and which particular areas you'll be auditing. Because sometimes it's just too difficult to audit every single thing in the organization. And focus on the high risk areas. So what should organizations implement? I've tried to keep things short on this slide here. There are a number of things that you can look at. For large organizations, it can be costly and time consuming, as I mentioned previously. So it's always good to focus your time, develop the scope and your criteria, develop an audit program. And what I mean by that is define your key processes, your high risk processes, and allocate your time and when you are going to conduct the auditing of these processes, whether it be every 6 months or every year. Come up with a detailed program, lay it out in a calendar, and ensure people are aware as well that this is the audit program and this is what the organization will be audited against. So lay out the process for identifying and recording issues. This is just one possible approach for recording issues. Feel free to adapt it or use the terminology that's appropriate to your organization. It could be as simple as a pass-fail criteria or a major or minor issue. So it's really whatever works best. There's no horses for courses in this internal auditing scenario. So what I've used here is a rating system. It's a sort of a five criteria rating system. It's pretty self-explanatory. The first one is a system failure, and it could be a major issue where an internal audit just has not been undertaken. The second one is if there's a gap in the system. So if there's inadequate document or the risks just haven't been identified, inadequate training, it's also a gap. And the third criteria is if there's repeat issues. So if you look back at previous audit reports, there's a lot of data and information in there. Look at what's happening, look at some trends, and try to get an indication of what's really repeating, what's a consistent issue that keeps coming up. Again, kind of related to that is the escalation of potential issues. If you see an issue that's coming up, then make sure you escalate it, and make sure you see a trend in terms of things being improved. Keep a record of these issues, and go back to actually finding out what the root cause of some of these issues are. And then finally, the non-conforming or reoccurring themes, which could be a combination of audits not being planned properly, incorrect templates being used, and yes, so very similar to repeat issues, but more focused on the major issues and the major risks around the organization. Just some references and further reading if you want to find out a little bit more about the auditing of management systems. And look, that's pretty much about it. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you've learned about internal auditing, the importance of doing it well, and some practical things to implement as an auditor or as a consultant within your organization. If you require any further information or questions, please feel free to get in touch. My details are on this slide. We've also got a eRisk 360 training academy. You can access this via the website. There are plenty of free resources that you can access. And as I mentioned, we also provide some online training and a free podcast series as well. So please make use of these free resources, and thanks again for listening. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Craig D'Souza, for that presentation covering the basics of internal auditing and risk. And that concludes this presentation.